Well, it turns out I have to admit I was wrong, because it turns out there is even more to this story. In case you haven't seen my prior video on this topic, there has been this ongoing drama in the fitness industry between Dr. Mike Isochello, who's one of the big guys in the industry, big, overconfident guy, tends to say a lot of outlandish stuff, tends to be a bit arrogant, and so he's attracted, obviously, a bit of a hate following from people who think that he's a bit full of himself. Then on the other hand, you have this guy Solomon Nelson, who essentially went back and found Dr. Mike's PhD thesis and found that it was riddled with what looks like typos, errors, issues with the data being incorrectly reported, and so on, which makes Dr. Mike look really bad. It makes him look, intellectually not as good, and essentially Solomon does this hour-long takedown video on it. Then Dr. Mike comes back and says, actually, it turns out that was the wrong draft. That was not the final draft. That was an earlier draft. And so the actual version of my PhD thesis had all of that stuff corrected. And it just so happened that we got the wrong file uploaded to the website. And so you're looking at the wrong file. And then to add some additional context, as I laid out in my last video, the other issue is that Solomon Nelson is a guy who is very closely associated with Lyle McDonald, who is a person who I generally find to be very intellectually dishonest, not generally very interested in the actual science of things, just really more of a drama hound. And so knowing that he aligns himself with Lyle McDonald, I would tend to view Solomon Nelson in the same light. And so my prior take was that it generally looked like Dr. Mike was completely in the right in this situation, even if me and other folks have issues with some of the things he does and says online. Well, there is a new layer to the drama, which is that it turns out that might not be true either. It turns out that the draft, supposedly, that was the older draft, may not actually have been the older draft after all. So, some sleuths online didn't really buy this interpretation, they didn't really buy this argument, and they went through and they, compared file dates and things like that, and they found that it looks like the version that was passed off as the correct version doesn't seem to line up. And they thought that maybe it was something where Mike edited it afterwards to, make it look like it was the right document, and in fact, the version that had passed was, again, the one that was bad. So there are accusations that he intentionally edited things. So then a couple days ago, Dr. Mike makes this statement on his Instagram. He says, upon review, the dissertation Solomon examined was indeed the correct document. Most of the errors were clerical, a misplaced negative sign on a few correlations, and a table pasting misalignment repeated across 3 tables. These are now fixed and will appear in the official archive. For full transparency, the original, the corrected copy, and the data tables are linked in Milo Wolf's video description. It's a trip taking out this much criticism at once, but I've dished out plenty myself, fair play. And so this led to a lot of confusion, because admittedly, it basically was a complete reversal of all the things he'd been saying so far. And it also doesn't really explain the situation, like what's going on, how did this all happen? And it doesn't really, take accountability. I mean, it does obviously take some amount of accountability, but maybe, doesn't just say, like, I fucked up, anything along those lines. It just kind of is a very unclear statement. He follows this up shortly after that, saying, I'll be posting a full update on dissertation things ASAP, then going live on here to give the rundown and take as many questions as I can. See you guys in a bit. So he says, okay, I'm going to make a bigger statement shortly. Then the big statement comes out. It's a big one. It's a multi-part, quite a few points. So I will go through those now. 1 says, YouTuber Solomon Nelson made a critique video of my officially posted dissertation. The dissertation was 1/3 of my PhD, so this is a big deal. I had no intention of responding because I wasn't going to doubt that my dissertation had plenty of errors, so it was on brand for me. That's a bit odd of an argument, I would say. He goes on the internet and talks about how he's the smartest guy in the world, and generally I think if you're the smartest guy in the world, you probably don't make a lot of pretty basic spelling errors. Admittedly, that's coming from me. I'm an English literature major, and so I tend to think it's pretty easy to avoid making typos. We live in the age of spell checkers. It's, I think, generally not that hard not to include a ton of huge typos, in your drafts even, but okay. He says, Solomon has a long history of making hate content about me. I've never responded to bad faith critiques. I made plenty of those myself. I don't expect folks to respond to them. Yeah, okay, sure, fair. Again, It's the internet, so it makes the world go round. Point number 3, Dr. Milo Wolf reached out to have a response to his channel, asked me to send over my dissertation. I sent him multiple files because I legitimately didn't know which one was the right file after 12 years. I told Milo I wasn't sure which file was which. This feels a little bit odd. I feel like you would probably know, like we have jokes about how you have so many copies of a file that you kind of name, like, hey, this one is the final draft or whatever. But I mean, generally, you should be able to figure out which one is the right one, or you should know, right? Bit odd that you wouldn't know which one was the final draft of your PhD, but nevertheless. So upon looking over the files, Milo found one file that he suspected was actually the closer one to the final version of the dissertation. He included that file in a video response, linked it as well with my permission. I was on the vid. We both claimed that Solomon was likely critiquing a less than updated dissertation. That seems a little bit odd as well. I mean, they really presented it as a definite answer, as if they did their due diligence on this. So finding out that they didn't, and it was just sort of a guess, or they just sort of happened to pick the wrong version amongst the versions that they had, feels a bit odd, right? And it also throws Milo under the bus. I mean, a little bit. It's kind of like, oh yeah, like I just had all this stuff. I just passed it off to Milo, and Milo, found it and thought it was the right one, and it was just a mistake. I mean, it doesn't obviously. It's not saying that Milo did something intentional, but it is a bit odd, right? It's kind of like, well, wait a second. He says, I did not double check the files before Milo posted them. This is 100% on me. Okay, great. That is maybe some accountability there. He says, big mistake. A few days later, I dove into the files, realized the version of the dissertation posted was actually an even older version than the one Solomon critiqued. The file used in Milo's response was not only an older version, but has very different formatting and content than the official dissertation reviewed. I asked Milo to amend and correct his video description, which he did, and I posted the clarification on my Instagram. So this is, I think, where a lot of the people covering this story get a little bit hung up, and it's because, essentially they're saying, hey, how is it possible that you had an older version that had fewer errors? However, I would actually tend to agree or defend this statement, because he also says, hey, it has very different formatting, right? So if you had a version that was an earlier version, maybe, it looked nicer, was better, it had all the right stuff, but then you were, hey, you need to totally change the formatting of it. You need to, totally change the structure of this. Then you would have to obviously do really significant edits. You'd have to rewrite huge parts of it. And again, maybe if you did it quickly, or, you're not so great at the spell checking, again, I think you should be. But, if that is the case, then I can understand how this would result in a document that had more errors in it compared to the previous one. So I think that's fine. However, again, there's a lot of stuff here that's starting to add up to a little bit of weirdness, right? So that's one among many things. He says, just this morning, my doctoral advisor sent me the latest version of my committee-reviewed dissertation from 2013 that he was able to find in his email. I didn't happen to have this version in my files when all this happened, but it does have most of the stats corrected. So it appears as if not only was the dissertation that's currently in the university portal the incorrect version, but my initial assumption that the other file might be the more correct file was also wrong. That's 2 mistakes, 100% on me. So he's actually saying, yes, Solomon did in fact review the latest file that I had, but it was also still not the right file because there was an even later version that my doctoral advisor happened to have, and I didn't happen to have that. Which again is very odd. Why do you not have a copy of the final version of your PhD thesis? A bit odd. He says, at no point during any of this process did I retroactively edit the dissertation copy Solomon critiqued and tried to claim it as an older copy. I have every single file in a Dropbox for full transparency. And then, he has all the files listed. And then he says, I reacted too quickly to this. I should have taken the time to double check everything before responding. That's what caused this big mix-up. At no point did I or will I intentionally obfuscate the truth of the matter, as I never want to do anything but cut you guys the real deal. My apologies to everyone for so poorly mishandling this. Milo Pack and all others who backed me in good faith have zero blame in this. I have 100% blame. Okay, that's taking some accountability. This is interesting because it puts me in a position I don't want to be in. Well, A, admitting I was probably wrong in my last video. That's fine. Whatever. I'll admit when I'm wrong. But I think the position I don't want to be in is having to go back to an argument I would have made last time instead, if I had had this information. So here's my general perspective on this thing. I think that, like I mentioned previously, I think a bit less of people if they make a lot of typos, if they have a paper that has a lot of typos, etc. Again, I'm an English major. I tend to think of that stuff as pretty important. And, so for me, it's like, hey, a base prerequisite to being a certain level of intelligence is that you're probably going to be able to, write a solid paper without making many obvious typos, or, even in a first draft before you pass that off to somebody else making a lot of typos, right? I'm also somebody who works in video games for a living, and so I'm very precise with data. I double and triple check everything. And so if I had something where, it was like, oh, there was a table that was wrong, I would catch that as well. This is stuff that I think personally, sort of the things I think of as intelligence, these are things that I would have caught and corrected, right? However, I also recognize that that's not the case for everybody. I've seen insanely, people on both ends of the spectrum, right? I've seen people who could code, incredibly, who could not write a sentence, who could not write their way out of a paper bag. I've seen people who could, write, all day, who cannot do anything involving numbers or data. Their brain just shuts down, right? That's not to say necessarily that a level of sloppiness is okay, but it is to say that essentially, like, hey, if you have somebody who makes a lot of typos, who makes some data table errors here and there, that doesn't necessarily compromise the entirety of their body of work. And in particular, basically it's kind of the university's responsibility to be double checking this, to be making sure that the final draft of the paper turns out good. And if it didn't, that's partly on the university's fault. And we could talk all day about how that reflects poorly on sort of the state of, just the university system and exercise science in general. Yeah, totally. But I also would say that you can't blame Dr. Mike if the system that he is working in is flawed. That's not on him. That's, yes, maybe it's a bad state of the environment, but that's not his fault. What is his fault, I think, if anything, is whatever is going on with this mess with potentially covering things up. Because I think it is kind of suspicious, this official timeline that he's given. The fact that he's had to give in this official timeline because he, made a lot of mistakes in the process, all of that stuff looks bad. I think all of that stuff looks a lot worse than potentially just having made a lot of typos and errors in your PhD thesis. I do think that really what matters at the end of the day is the quality of the research done, right? So if you have done quality research and the research was all correct and you just happen to write up a pretty, typo-ridden paper, at the end of all of that, to me, that doesn't really matter that much, because the reality is that, yes, you did the research, you did it well, you just didn't write a paper at the end too well. And again, that is kind of what your PhD is about. Your PhD is about, hey, can you write this nice paper at the end? And so, yes, does that make him look bad? Yes. Does that mean that, his PhD should be revoked? I don't really think so. I mean, I think that obviously he graduated by the standards that were set for him, very obviously, or else he wouldn't have gotten through. And so for that, yes, he gets a PhD. Great. I should also add that obviously Dr. Mike in general has probably been a net positive to the industry. As whatever gripes you have with him, whatever critiques you have of him, obviously he has this huge body of work after he got his PhD that, generally has been very positive for just sort of the evidence-based sector of the fitness industry. Again, not to say that he hasn't said a lot of things that I would disagree with, just that I don't think this invalidates his entire body of work. And again, I think Solomon Nelson is probably mostly just a drama hound, somebody who's looking to stir up shit because that's just what's happening. He's, looking to take down a big guy because he doesn't like him. Sure, fine, whatever. But again, I think that really the thing that does make me take pause, the thing that does make me, maybe think a little bit less of Dr. Mike is just this whole drama. This whole, I didn't know, which version was the right version. I didn't bother doing my due diligence on having it. I didn't bother, really sorting things out before I, sort of made this video. And all of these, it just so happens that, this thing happened, and this thing happened, and this thing happened, and there's 4 implausible things in a row that seem a little bit off, right? All of that is kind of the stuff that makes me go, okay, yeah, there's something here that I don't like, right? And it does make me wonder if he did try and edit some things and pass it off as, basically the corrected version. I don't know. Obviously, I will never know. I will not be there. I will not have any proof. I don't have the original files. I don't know what happened in 2013, etc. Right? I don't know any of that stuff. So this is all just me, a random person on the internet yapping. Fine, whatever. What does this say about the state of the industry? Well, obviously, our exercise science needs to advance as a field, right? We know this. That's always been true, 100%. It's, again, relatively a field in its infancy. The amount of research that we have, the amount of funding that we have is very minimal. We have a lot more now than we did 10, 20 years ago, but even that is, riddled with holes. There's not really a lot of really confident data on a lot of major topics. And there are basically just structural difficulties that make it hard to study at the elite levels of performance. So if anything, I think that what is really most likely is just that this is kind of a side effect of the environment being the way that it is. I don't like it. A lot of folks don't like it, but I mean, that is kind of the reality in a lot of ways. Obviously, we are all hoping that things will improve in the future. We'll hope that there are better standards. We'll hope that, the next Dr. Mike in 20, 30 years is, probably going to be a little bit more polished, a little bit better at this kind of thing. And, this is why I hate covering drama in the community, because, you have to be like, I wanted to make videos about some other stuff this week with my video making time, honestly. I had some other topics that I was interested in covering. But here we are, right? I have to make more videos about this crap. It's never ending. I'm sure Solomon Nelson is going to come out with another video in 3 more days. Gonna have to respond to that one in the next video. I don't know. I mean, it's nice for endlessly generating content, but it's like, Christ, I would like to talk about something else, actually. I would like to, just go lift some weights. I think that's important. Go lift some weights. Go lift some weights. That's all for today's video. As always, don't hesitate to like, comment, subscribe, smash the notification bell, comment down below. Let me know all those hate comments you got. I got some ones in the last video. Thank you so much, everybody. Very helpful. Anyway, have a good week. Talk to you all next time.